NYMEX, the New York Mercantile Exchange, the largest oil trading market in the world.
Chef 101, 105 call spread, 102.90.
Billions of dollars of oil and gas contracts pass across these screens.
99.03. Join me.
Energy that's vital to the survival of the US economy.
And it's these traders who are buying and selling those contracts based on what the future price of oil might get to. Essentially one huge betting game, largely controlled by investment banks and hedge funds.
When protests flared across the Arab world earlier this year, investors here became deeply concerned.
You had Bahrain, you had Saudi Arabia, and these protesters were starting to spread and things like that. And we looked at this and said, wait a minute, this could be very bad.
Stabilizing the oil markets has been a central tenet of US foreign policy for decades. It's often meant empowering dictators in oil-producing countries at the expense of supporting democratic ideals.
So 125 total.
But the Arab Spring has brought about change nobody expected, including the Obama administration. While the US has become engaged in a civil war in North Africa, its approach towards the oil-rich Gulf has been very different.
That's terrible. That's terrible.
What are we going to do, as I said? We're going to stop buying their oil? That's inconceivable. We need it for the functioning of our economies.
Bahrain is a country where foreign journalists have been banned. Fault Lines has come here at the invitation of the US military, which has its Middle East Navy headquarters in this tiny Gulf state. We're also here for another reason, to secretly meet those who've been protesting and calling for democracy, and find out how they feel about the lack of US intervention here. We've been speaking to people who've been reporting here recently over the past few weeks, saying that they've been moving hotels 4 times in any given week, trying to escape the eye of authorities who are really cracking down on media coverage of the events here. So we really don't know what to expect. It's a very strange situation that we're in. The Arab Spring came to Bahrain on February the 14th, when protesters took to the streets calling for economic reform and political equality for the country's majority Shia community. Labeled as agents of Iran by the government, Bahraini security forces opened fire days later on the crowds at the Pearl Roundabout. The United Nations called the response shocking and blatant violations of international law. More than 30 people have been killed and hundreds injured since the protests began.
From their work and targeted in their living, thousands of people prisoners for every 1,000 citizens today. All of them, or most of them, were systematically tortured, electrocuted, sexually harassed, sexually assaulted, hanged.
NABEEL RAJAB is one of the few human rights activists here willing to show his face on camera.
You have thousands of similar cases.
Really? NABEEL gives counseling and advice to families caught in the violence. He told us that given the strong US military presence in Bahrain, one of the questions they most often ask is why the US hasn't done more.
The silence of United States have disappointed people very much. It is very much clear now to the United States is democracy and human rights should be applied only in those countries where United States have a problem with, but not with those dictatorship they have a good relation with. And we see that very clearly.
NABEEL's house is under constant surveillance. We're taking what precautions we can to get our material out safely and protect the identities of those who don't want their faces shown. Protesters that have spoken with Al Jazeera before have been beaten, arrested, or gone missing. But some are still willing to speak out.
If every person kept silence, then the external world will not know our problem. Then we have to blame ourselves for being silent.
Syed Youssef was a teacher. He was fired after taking part in the protests at the Pearl Roundabout. Like NABEEL, he's disappointed by America's response.
After the visit of Secretary of Defense to Bahrain, they have attacked the roundabout after one day. And after the visit of the Deputy of Secretary of Foreign Affairs. They have a store in Waydrat village. And after every visit, especially this Jeffrey Feltman, his reputation is very bad here. People are talking about him badly.
The King and the Crown Prince have outlined a vision for Bahrain by which the moderate voices would work together to chart a positive path forward, and that's what we want to see.
Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman is the lead official for the US State Department handling all Middle East affairs. He's visited Bahrain 8 times since February.
These protesters know you by name. They know that you visited the country several times. I mean, what they ask is that the US speaks out and condemns what's going on there in stronger terms.
But again, I would just go back to what I said. It may not be satisfactory to those who wish that we would beat our chests and jump and run, and sort of issue lots of statements. We need to look at how is best to promote our policies in any country in the world, depending on the relationship we have with that country, depending on the other strategic interests we have in that country.
One strategic interest the US has in Bahrain is the presence of the Fifth Fleet, America's most important naval base. From their headquarters in Manama, the fleet covers nearly 7 million square kilometers of maritime territory, but most importantly, the vital shipping lanes for Middle East oil.
All civilized people benefit from this free flow of goods and services. So a vast majority of the world's energy comes out of this region, which is one of the reasons it's such an important region for everybody.
Less than 250 kilometers from the coast of Iran, the island of Bahrain is ruled by a Sunni royal family, the Al Khalifas. Their rule is backed by their powerful Sunni neighbor and America's strongest ally in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia.
I think the calculations of Bahrain are much more complex and difficult for us because, number one, our Fifth Fleet is stationed there. Number two, Bahrain, of course, is important to Saudi Arabia, one of our major partners in the Arab world. And number three, no one wants to see Iran, which is a government that we despise, profit from these changes in the Arab world. I think all those calculations have led the United States government to be much more cautious.
On the 14th of March, after nearly a month of protests, Saudi Arabia dispatched a military force of 1,000 troops to help put down the protests in Bahrain. US officials have said they were not informed the Saudis were heading across the border, even though US Secretary of Defense Robert Gates met with the Bahraini ruling family just days before.
You think they told the US they were sending Saudi troops into Bahrain?
No, they just did it. They did not consult us. They considered it their business, not ours.
They've lost faith, perhaps, in the US support for that?
Because they thought we ran away from Mubarak.
Saudi Arabia's decision to send 1,000 troops along this causeway into Bahrain was widely seen here as an attempt to counter the perceived threat of Iran. They were there to crush the protests, but many feel that this was a shot across the bow for Tehran. No one from Bahrain's government would speak to us about the crackdown. But there are people here who think it was justified. ADEL MAYMOON is a Sunni businessman.
Okay, here in Bahrain, when you say you're protesting because of your poor living situation, come on, that's a joke. It cannot be. My office boy has 3 mobiles. Okay, and later on, the evidence it showed up about Iran's involvement, and of course Hezbollah from Lebanon, which is backed by Iran.
The characterization of the protests as a regional power grab by Iran is made by US officials too. It stems from sectarian dynamics in this Sunni-ruled country, where roughly 2/3 of the population is Shia.
The reports of the destruction of Shia mosques in some villages and this being part of the crackdown, I mean, do you think that's true? And if so, do you think
I can say you one thing. I'm a Bahraini. I'm living in Bahrain. And during the previous period, from the start of the protests and everything, I have never left the country. There is no single Shia mosque which has been demolished.
But we'd heard differently, that in villages north of Bahrain's capital, it was possible to see evidence of the destruction.
Okay, no, just down, yeah, don't worry.
With police checkpoints everywhere, it was difficult to film without getting caught.
Try to find a way around the checkpoints that we've just seen, blocking the entrance to the village of Nawadrat, which was raided just a couple of days ago.
After a detour, we managed to reach a pre-arranged meeting point with a contact in the protest movement.
Okay, I have a number. We have a big white SUV behind a mosque. Yep.
That's Adwara. That's mosque. Here.
Yeah.
On that, they are destroyed.
This is clearly the remains of a destroyed mosque. There are religious books lying amongst the rubble. It was destroyed by JCB diggers in the past few weeks during the crackdown, and apparently this is going on all over Bahrain. Yeah, down there. We're told that we have to move on very quickly because there are people watching these areas.
Yes.
If we hang around too long, the police are going to turn up.
After showing us more destroyed buildings, our contact took us to meet a man whose two brothers had recently been taken away by the police.
We don't know, that's the problem, we don't know what is the situation. He's alive or not, we don't know. We cannot go to ask about him, because if we go there, they will catch us also.
Everybody's in the same situation.
All of us, all Bahraini people.
The climate of fear is palpable here, and once again there's disbelief that the US isn't doing more.
I mean, the US, the people, I'm sure they are with us. They are trying to help us, the people. But the government, I don't know why. Maybe because they have the fifth base here, I don't know the base.
Are you concerned by the reports of human rights abuses that have gone on since the protests began in February?
You know, I'm focused on what goes on in the water and in the maritime domain.
So that doesn't affect your presence here or your position? That's not something that
we have a long-standing relationship with the Kingdom of Bahrain, and they are a very solid partner.
But is there any level of human rights abuse that could affect the position of the US military here? I mean, if
the Kingdom of Bahrain is a long-standing partner, and we are very committed to the relationship, and they're an important part. We've been here for 60 years.
Stepping onto the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan is like getting a front row seat to US military strategy in the Middle East. We're just off the coast of Iran on a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier packed with the latest military hardware. There are more than 5,000 US servicemen and women on board. It costs $1 million a day to operate this ship. The US Navy now keeps 2 carriers in the region at all times.
There are dozens of aircraft on this carrier. Most of them are fighter jets like this, running operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and throughout the Middle East. And the sense that people have here is that not only is this a mission to support allies of the US throughout the region by reassuring them there is a solid military footprint here, but also as a stern reminder to adversaries of the US also that the US military isn't far away.
Just our presence alone out here, you know, us, you know, having our military ground forces, having our air support and everything sends a very strong message to, you know, the enemy over there, saying that we are here and we are ready to strike and support our ground troops, you know, if necessary. So, very big role.
It's about 44 nautical miles to Iran.
From where we are here?
Right, from where we are right now.
Okay.
The bridge of the ship is where potential threats to the shipping lanes are monitored. Sailors here are constantly on the lookout.
there's tankers, there's cargo vessels, there's dhows, lots of vessels out there. A very vital area of the world that plenty of folks are using it for plenty of different purposes.
The ship's stated mission is using air support to protect US troops on the ground. But it's also here to protect the US economy by keeping energy flowing through the Straits of Hormuz.
This is a particularly challenging stretch of water to navigate. Not only is it one of the busiest oil export channels in the world, but on one side you have the coast of Iran, and less than 150 nautical miles away, the coast of Saudi Arabia. In the middle, the USS Ronald Reagan, acting as a buffer.
Two regional superpowers, one a US ally, the other a sworn enemy of Washington, with billions of dollars of oil shipments flowing in between. The USS Ronald Reagan is almost like an insurance policy for the energy markets.
To withdraw from that space, particularly if it were precipitously, would be a real game changer.
Given the turmoil in the region, I think it settles things down and reduces the risks of open military conflict between nations.
It'd be more important than the United States one day withdrawing from Iraq or Afghanistan. This would be a very big deal indeed for the oil markets.
Do you think it sends a message to have that kind of militarized presence?
Yeah, I think it does. I think everybody takes note of it, and they realize that they couldn't take military action without first thinking about and fearing the consequences. And I think that's good.
Demonstrations in the Gulf haven't been confined to Bahrain. People have taken to the streets in Iraq, Oman, Kuwait, and in early March, in eastern Saudi Arabia, where the majority of the country's oil reserves are located. In and around the city of Qatif, protesters marched demanding democratic reforms. As in Bahrain, they were mainly from the Shia community, a minority in Saudi Arabia. Also, as in Bahrain, security forces opened fire on crowds. King Abdullah, now 87 years old, has responded with the carrot as well as the stick, simultaneously launching a $100 billion spending program, as well as a brutal crackdown.
I think, though, Saudi Arabia itself faces a choice in terms of reform or trying to clamp down on any dissent. I think that's a very stark choice it has. If they pursue a more security-led approach, is what we've seen in Bahrain right now and what we've seen in parts of the kingdom, I fear that the response may well then be something which is more sinister for the Saudi leadership.
The Saudi government denied fault lines permission to enter the country. So we tried to meet some of those who've been protesting outside Saudi's borders. The borders between these Gulf countries are often right in the middle of the desert. There's often no real delineation between one country and the next. We're right now headed to the frontier with Saudi Arabia over these dunes. We've arranged to speak with some Saudi Arabian dissidents about the situation in that country. On this occasion, they weren't able to cross the border, saying it was too dangerous. So we rigged up a satellite to speak to them over the internet. How big are these protests?
Every village, maybe they can reach 300 to 400 people. But once it was the biggest one during the protests. It was after the Saudi army get to the Bahrain. It reached 5,000 people in all Qatif. And I know there is so many people want to go out and want to shout for their rights, but they can't. Even they are afraid, or they can't guess what the Saudi government will do for them.
Do you feel that the authorities are watching and are trying to resist any spreading of this protest?
They always feel dangerous from the Shia. They are always afraid that we are just as soldiers of Iran. We are not.
You know, the interdynamics of the country is changing. There are difficulties. The government really failed to redress these difficulties, for instance, unemployment, poverty, alienation of different groups.
What are you calling for? What's your ultimate objective?
If people could have a voice and a choice to elect their officials, their representative that could scrutinize the government, could limit the authority of the royal family, this is our ultimate goal.
But that goal still seems far off. People we spoke with didn't anticipate any real reform soon. And for the US, support for the House of Saud means a counterweight to Iran, clamping down on funding for Al-Qaeda and maintaining a free flow of oil.
Those are real interests. You can't disregard them. You can't just sweep them aside and say they don't mean anything. I think in the real world, as governments make decisions, governments will balance these interests. And sometimes the balance will be in favor of the geopolitical interests, and sometimes the balance will be in favor of the political or democratic interests.
Right now, there's nothing to say about Saudi Arabia, and it's really unclear what's going to happen. What I think is important is that Saudi Arabia not become the center of a counter-revolution. I think that doesn't serve Saudi's interests, and it certainly doesn't serve the interests of the region.
So it is with great confidence and faith in our future that I welcome the President of the United States, Barack Obama.
When Barack Obama made his speech in May outlining the US position on the historic changes in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia didn't even get a mention. But he did mention Bahrain.
Nevertheless, we have insisted both publicly and privately that mass arrests and brute force are at odds with the universal rights of Bahrain citizens.
On our last night in Manama, we watched the speech with a member of the largest opposition party in Bahrain. Al-Wafaq has had 2 of its members imprisoned since the crackdown. It's recently pulled out of talks with Bahrain's rulers, saying they're not serious about reform.
I believe that the American, they have, like all other people, they don't want to anger their friends or their closest regime.
For Syed, and for many people living in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia who've taken huge risks by taking to the streets, the issue is that President Obama's words have been selective, supporting protester-led uprisings in some parts of the Arab world, but not others.
In Cairo, we heard the voice of the young mother who said, "It's like I can finally breathe fresh air for the first time."
The United States foreign policy and national security interests are, well, they're dictated by precisely that, our national interests. So a lot of these remain consistent over time.
In Sana'a, we heard the students who chanted, "The night must come to an end."
For the last 50 years, there's been, an unspoken, unholy alliance between us and the Arab autocrats. They sell us oil at too high a price, and we provide them with arms. That can't be the deal into the future.
In Benghazi, we heard the engineer who said, "Our words are free now. It's a feeling you can't explain."
In some countries, you've seen the United States stand up very clearly for values and for human rights and for democracy. In other instances, we've seen the United States act to protect, in essence, and defend the status quo.
In Damascus, we heard the young man who said, "After the first yelling, the first shout, you feel dignity."
In Bahrain, we heard the protesters who had the courage to call for change. It's a call that's being silenced while America watches on, mindful of its interests in this part of the Middle East.